preacher emerges from the sands. A pact is made with a warlord, and a fire is lit that will reshape the Islamic world. This is the story of Wahhabism, born in the desert, spread by the sword, and still burning through modern history. In 1703, deep in the arid heartland of Central Arabia, a boy was born in the small town of Uyana. His name was Muhammad ibn Abd. From a young age, he was obsessed with the purity of Islam, readings, memorizing, and studying the Quran and Hadith with intensity. But as he grew older, his devotion transformed into dismay. He looked around and saw Muslims praying at graves, seeking blessings from saints, hanging charms for protection, and participating in festivals he believed had no basis in the Quran or Sunnah. To him, this was nothing short of shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with God. He didn't just consider these practices misguided, he considered them a threat to Islam itself. He believed that Islam had drifted far from its original message. And so, he made it his mission to return the religion to its purest form. A form he believed existed only during the time of the Prophet Muhammad and his closest companions. Wahhabism, at its heart, a reformist revivalist movement, but one with rigid parameters. Its core belief is Tawheed, absolute monotheism, not just believing in one God, but purifying worship so that no act of devotion is directed at anything other than Allah. That meant no intercession from saints, no visits to shrines, no honoring the Prophet's grave in ways that could suggest veneration. Even things like celebrating the Prophet's birthday were condemned as innovation. This was not just a theological preference, it was a line in the sand. And those who crossed it, according to Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, were not just mistaken, they were apostates. And apostasy, in his worldview, could be punished by death. He began preaching. At first, quietly, then loudly and forcefully. But his message wasn't welcomed. Local rulers and religious scholars viewed him as a threat. His rejection of traditional jurisprudence, his denunciation of long-standing customs, and his harsh condemnations alienated much of the scholarly world. He was exiled from one town after another, till he found refuge in a place that would change everything, Dir in 1744. In the arid plains of Najd, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab made a pact with a rising tribal leader named Muhammad ibn Saud. It was a simple agreement with monumental consequences. Ibn Saud would provide protection and military backing. And in return, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab would provide religious legitimacy. It was the merging of the sword and the sermon, a military alliance. Wrapped in religious authority, together they launched a campaign across Arabia. Not just against non-Muslims, but against other Muslims. They targeted graves, shrines, Sufi lodges, and anyone who resisted their ideology. Their forces carried a black and white banner of reform, but they moved like conquerors. Towns were conquered. Mosques destroyed, communities declared heretical. Opponents were branded as apostates and killed. In 1802, they attacked the holy city of Kabul, a sacred site for Shia Muslims. They massacred hundreds and destroyed the shrine of Imam Hussein. 1 year later, they seized Mecca, purging the city of any practices they deemed innovations, too many across the Islamic world. This wasn't reform, it was extremism. The Ottomans, guardians of the holy cities, sent Egyptian forces to crush the rebellion. In 1818, Dir was destroyed, and the first Saudi state collapsed. But the ideology did not die, simply waited. Fast forward to the early 20th century, Arabia was fractured. Tribal warfare was rampant. And then, in 1902, a bold young warrior named Abdulaziz ibn Saud, a descendant of the original Saudi Wahhabi alliance, recaptured Riyadh with calculated ambition. He revived the old pact, religious legitimacy from the Wahhabi scholars in exchange for protection and power. Over the next 2 decades, he expanded his territory, eventually capturing Mecca and Medina in the 1920s, once again bringing Islam's to holiest cities under Wahhabi control. In 1932, he declared the formation of a new state, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This new kingdom was built on 3 pillars: the sword, the creed, and soon, something even more powerful, oil. In 1938, the Persian Gulf. Drillers struck oil at Dammam Well 7, and suddenly, this desert kingdom had more than ideology. It had immense wealth. By the 1970s, with petrodollars flowing, Saudi Arabia began exporting its version of Islam around the world. This wasn't just philanthropy, it was strategic religious engineering. They built over 1,500 mosques, 200 Islamic centers, and dozens of schools and universities across the Muslim world. They translated Wahhabi texts into multiple languages. They sent trained clerics abroad, from Morocco to Malaysia, from Kosovo to Kashmir. Wahhabi teachings began to spread. Their version of Islam was strict, literalist, and legalistic. It discouraged philosophical thinking, condemned mysticism, and viewed centuries of Islamic tradition, especially in the fields of theology and jurisprudence, as corrupted. Even the four main Sunni schools of law were often sidelined in favor of direct Quranic literalism. This movement became known as Petro-Islam, and its influence was far-reaching. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. In 1979, the world's attention turned once again to Mecca. Just days after the Iranian Revolution, hundreds of armed men stormed the Grand Mosque. They claimed the Mahdi had arrived. The siege lasted 2 weeks. Saudi forces, with help from foreign specialists, eventually reclaimed the mosque. Hundreds died. The attackers, they were Wahhabi students, young men who had turned the doctrine back on the very regime that nurtured it. In response, the kingdom made a fateful decision: double down on religious control. Wahhabi clerics were given more authority. Schools became more conservative. The religious police expanded their power. Saudi Arabia continued funding Wahhabi projects abroad, hoping to guide the ideology before it turned against them again. But it did. In the 1980s, Arab fighters joined the Afghan jihad. Among them was Osama bin Laden, who would later form al-Qaeda. His ideology drew from Wahhabi doctrine, particularly its use of takfir, the idea that Muslims who stray from the correct path are no longer Muslims and may be fought. After U.S. troops entered Saudi Arabia in 1991, bin Laden turned his fury toward the kingdom and the West. Then came September 11, 2001. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi. The world was stunned. Suddenly, Wahhabism was no longer an internal matter. It was a global threat. Western governments examined how Saudi money and Wahhabi literature contributed to radicalization. Some reforms followed, but the damage was already done. In 2017, a new leader rose, Muhammad bin Salman, or MBS. He promised to modernize Saudi Arabia, and in many ways he did. Women could drive. Concerts returned. Religious police were curbed. Distanced the kingdom from overt Wahhabi control. Clerics were silenced. School curricula changed. Wahhabism, once inseparable from Saudi identity, was no longer even mentioned. But critics argue this was not true reform. It's just a shift from religious authoritarianism to political authoritarianism. The ideology may be downplayed, but its legacy endures. Today, Wahhabism still influences legal systems, mosques, and scholars in parts of the Muslim world. But it is no longer the dominant voice. Younger generations are seeking broader interpretations of Islam. Scholars, reviving classical diversity and spiritual depth. Muslims around the world are saying, faith doesn't have to be harsh to be authentic. Yet the shadow remains. Wahhabism was born from a desire to purify. But in its pursuit of purity, it created division. It reshaped nations, fueled conflict, and left a global legacy that is still being reckoned with. So what comes next? Does Wahhabism fade into history or adapt into a new form? Quieter, subtler, but no less influential? Ideas don't die. They evolve. They linger, and sometimes burn.